Now we will talk about intrinsic motivation as opposed to extrinsic motivation, which you do for rewards, for external rewards. When we are talking about intrinsic motivation, you find the task itself rewarding, right? For example, little kids, they don't need to be paid money or given candies or whatever for them to play. The act of playing itself is rewarding for them. It is intrinsically rewarding for them. So wouldn't it be great if we figure out to intrinsically motivate people in the workplace? And what can we do to get them to be motivated to work, not just because of money, not because of some promotion or any other external rewards, but because they find the work itself very enjoyable, something very deeply satisfying, that they want to engage in that work more and more. That's what we will try to figure out in this video. Now, it's not that I haven't touched upon intrinsic motivation at all, because in goal setting theory, we touched upon intrinsic motivation as well. Goal setting, when done by the manager for you, it becomes extrinsic motivation. The manager sets goals for you. Then when you achieve those goals, you are rewarded. That becomes extrinsic motivation. But when you set goals for yourself, that is intrinsic motivation. No one told you to set goals, but you were intrinsically motivated to achieve something. So you set some goals and worked towards attaining those goals. And I gave you some specific things that you could do that will help you stay committed to attain this goal. So it's not that I haven't touched upon intrinsic motivation, but a large part of my previous video on motivation focused on extrinsic motivation. In this video, I will focus primarily on intrinsic motivation, and specifically I will go through one theory which is called the job characteristics model, which will give us some insights about how the nature of task that we are engaged in impacts our motivation, and more specifically intrinsic motivation. The job characteristics model was developed by Hackman and Oldham, two researchers, way back in the 1970s. There's a lot of research that has happened on this model since then. Very interesting theory, because it focuses on intrinsic motivation, specifically about how we should design our jobs so that people find those jobs intrinsically motivating. Similar to children finding the act of playing motivating. We don't have to reward them to play. So how should we design our jobs so that people enjoy working on those jobs? That's what they were interested in. And this was a really interesting perspective, especially in the 70s, because at that point of time, the dominant perspective was just use rewards, just use incentives, reinforcement theory, operant conditioning. So there are other theories of intrinsic motivation as well, but job characteristics model is very interesting in the sense that it focuses on the job. What are some of those characteristics, if present in a job, will make that job intrinsically motivating for the people engaged in those jobs? So that's what these researchers were interested in finding out. And they find out they identify 5 different characteristics that influence intrinsic motivation. First one is skill variety. You see, not all jobs are equal in terms of the variety of skills they require from you to perform well on those jobs. Some jobs may require just 1 or 2 skills for you to be effective on your job. Certain other jobs may require a multi-variety of skills. You need to be skillful in a whole host of areas for you to do well in that job. So the greater the skill variety, the more rewarding, the more intrinsically rewarding you will find that job. You will not find it boring. Imagine, say, a painter. Painter, not an artist painter, but somebody who paints the walls of houses. Okay. If that's the job, of course, there are some amount of variety within that job as well, in terms of figuring out the right kind of brush, figuring out ways to reach different corners of the wall. Some may not be easily reachable, and how to paint different type parts of the wall, or how to paint the roof, and so on and so forth. So there is some variety involved, but nonetheless it is all very unidimensional, all focused on painting the walls and roof. In contrast, if say you were actually a painter but an artist, you need more skills, right? Now here it is not just painting the same color on the entire wall. It's about, first of all, conceptualizing a painting idea, making rough sketches, making a final sketch, then doing the necessary paintings, finding the right contrast of colors that will express the emotion that you want to get expressed in that painting. Even after that, even after you have completed the painting, it's about figuring out ways to market that painting so that it can be sold and you can earn your livelihood, right? So many more different types of skills are involved here, as opposed to somebody who is a painter but only painting the walls. My job involves a whole variety of skills. Of course, even in teaching, I have to be able to give convincing lectures. I have to have knowledge in my area, different areas that I teach. I need to be able to get people excited about different topics. Then that is the teaching aspect. There is also, I need to be able to, even within teaching, I have to be able to guide people in their in the discipline. So that I can provide feedback on where they are doing things right, where they are doing things wrong, provide guidance in a way that they find it constructive so that they can develop. So these are many skills even within teaching. Then when it comes to research, even greater variety of skills. I should be able to conceptualize a project, a research project that would be of relevance, that would be of potentially impactful kind of research project, figuring out the right kind of research project that will fill the gaps in the literature. Then conducting, figuring out how to study those research questions with respect to figuring out experiments or survey studies. Then collecting that data, analyzing that data using different statistical methods, writing the report, writing the entire paper, sending it for publication, addressing the reviewers' comments, and finally getting the paper published. So you can see there's a whole variety of skills that are involved here, right? So the greater the variety of skills that are involved, the more deeply satisfying you find that work. If there is only a few types of skills that are involved, you won't find it as satisfying. It will be boring after a while. So that's the dimension of skill variety. The next one is task identity. So when it comes to task identity, this is especially relevant today because a lot of the jobs are in manufacturing assembly line kind of setups, where you are only doing a small part of the entire job process. For example, if you're talking about the manufacturing of a car, it's not that you as one person are collecting all the necessary parts and putting them together and building a car. That's rarely the case. In most car manufacturing setups, you are working on the assembly line, working only on small part of the assembly line. You may be responsible, say, just for bolting the doors to the car. That's all. You may be responsible. Not even all the doors, maybe only the passenger side doors. Somebody else may be working on the driver side doors, right? Uh, and even within the door, you are not doing everything. Somebody else may have taken care of the glass. Somebody else may have taken care of the different switches, the electricals. So you are doing only one small part of the job. So when that's the case, you will not get that deep sense of satisfaction that comes from having started a project and finishing the project and coming up with a final output. Because you are just small part of the long process of the entire big process. So jobs that involve you working on the whole piece of the work give you a deeper sense of satisfaction compared to jobs where you are only working on a small part of the work. Even going back to the example of my work on research, and part of that example relates to task identity as well. So when I am working on research projects, I am starting at the conceptualization level. I am involved from the very conceptualization of the research project to the process of implementing the research, to completing the research, to analyzing the research, to writing the research, and ultimately publishing it. So when the paper gets published, I gain a deep satisfaction that, hey, I created a paper. It was my creation, right? So that gives a deeper sense of satisfaction. Now, it's not that this was always the case. For example, even within my profession, I could be involved in small parts of a big project. In fact, that was the case when I was a doctoral student. I was, for example, involved in a research project by my professor. So he had conceptualized the project. He had designed the experiment that we would conduct to study the research question. My job was to conduct small part of the experiment, and then somebody else was doing the data analysis, somebody else was doing the writing, my professor was doing the writing, and I only involved in small parts of it, writing only on small sections, certain sections. So when I'm involved only in small parts, not the whole piece of project, then it becomes difficult for me to identify with that final product. So that is what we mean by task identity. Now, of course, it is not always possible. You can't create you can't create so many cars if you have to be involved from the start to finish of the development of a car. So, but as much as it is possible that you are involved in the creation of the whole piece of work, that will give you a deeper sense of satisfaction as opposed to you doing only small part of the work. So say within the car, if you are involved in the process of creating the whole engine, that will give you a deeper sense of satisfaction as opposed to you creating only a small part. So anyway, that's the idea. That's task identity. Then comes task significance. So certain jobs have a huge impact on the organization and sometimes even beyond the organization, for the society, right? Those jobs have what we call high task significance. The job of a physician, the job of a teacher, they have high significance. It's like you are making difference in the lives of people. Right now, with respect to the COVID pandemic, the doctors were doing the job before also, but right now, with the amount of work that they're putting and they saving lives, would be giving them even a deeper sense of significance. Previously on the job, they may not be saving as many lives, let's say, because the level of infection were few. But now, even with their overwork, they may be gaining a deeper sense of satisfaction because they are actually saving more lives. So task significance, that is what we are referring to, task significance. There was an interesting study that was done on teachers, like elementary school and middle school teachers, high school teachers, versus assembly line workers working in the automobile industry. This was done in Michigan, Detroit area. So in terms of extrinsic reward, in terms of monetary reward and benefits that come from the job, the assembly line workers were paid way more. Okay, and the teachers working in the same area, who lived in the same area, were earning a fraction of the amount that these assembly line workers were earning. Yet these teachers also had high job satisfaction. In fact, much more than the assembly line workers. Why? Because there is, of course, the aspect of assembly line workers having low task identity. They are only working on small piece of the work. But another reason why the teachers had high satisfaction, deeper satisfaction, was their job had high task significance. They were making differences in the lives of these kids. The assembly line workers didn't have that benefit. So you realize the kind of jobs that you do then can have impact on how intrinsically satisfied you will be with respect to doing those jobs. Anyway, the fourth one is autonomy. And again, I have touched upon autonomy, in fact, in my previous video as well. We like to, all of us, of course, the need may vary to a certain extent, but the greater the autonomy that we have, if somebody else is making all the decisions for us and we don't have much leeway with respect to what we do, how we do, when we do, then those jobs tend to be not very satisfying. The greater the autonomy we have, the more intrinsically satisfying those jobs will be. That is the reason I find my job deeply satisfying, because it gives me a lot of autonomy, which wasn't there in some of my previous jobs, right? So how much of freedom do you have? Some jobs give you a lot of freedom, some jobs not so much. In some jobs, you may be restricted, deeply restricted by the different laws, by the different policies. So you have very little degrees of freedom. Or in some other jobs, it's your boss who makes all the important decisions, controls everything. You don't have much leeway in the decision-making process. So those jobs will not be as satisfying. Those jobs, in fact, can turn out to be frustrating. So the greater autonomy you have, the more satisfying the jobs will be. And finally, feedback. We have also touched upon the feedback aspect when we were discussing goal setting theory. Again, by the way, here we are not talking about the supervisor giving feedback, but how the job itself gives you feedback on how well or poorly you have done the job. I gave you the example of mountain climbing, right? You get immediate feedback when you are not doing well because you slip and you fall. In fact, this is there is a researcher named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi who has done research on flow. Flow is the state where you get so involved in what you are doing that you literally lose track of time. It's like being in the zone. Okay, and one of the groups of people whom he studies in his research are these mountain climbers. When they are climbing those mountains, they are fully involved, they are fully present, because And one of the reasons is the feedback part. They immediately get feedback about how well or poorly they are doing. That helps them stay focused even better. So jobs that give us feedback on how well or poorly we are doing tend to be more deeply satisfying compared to jobs that don't give us that immediate feedback. Now, again, going back to my job, there are certain aspects of my job where I get immediate feedback on how well or poorly I'm doing. Now, right now I'm recording this lecture, so it's a little difficult to get immediate feedback. But when I'm doing this lecture in the classroom, physically in the classroom, I get immediate feedback from the, non-verbal expressions and sometimes also verbal feedback from my students about how well my lecture is going. Am I getting my students excited? Am I succeeding in communicating the ideas that I want to get communicated? So I'm getting that immediate feedback. And that's why teaching in front of a live audience is much more satisfying compared to teaching to a computer, right? To a camera. Because I will not get that immediate feedback. Even in my research, there are many aspects of my research that is deeply satisfying. There is high skill variety, there is high task identity, there is high task significance in terms of making possibility of doing research that can have significant impact on the field. There is of course great amount of autonomy, but when it comes to feedback, the research aspect of my job is a little problematic, because research takes a long time. So when I'm writing a book or when I'm writing a research paper, it takes a long time. I may not get immediate feedback on how well or poorly I'm doing until much later into the process, when I may get feedback from the reviewers. Okay, so you get the idea. The greater the job provides opportunity of getting immediate feedback on how well or poorly you are doing, the more you will be finding those jobs intrinsically satisfying. So these are the 5 characteristics talked about in the job characteristics model. So we have already discussed those characteristics: skill variety, task identity, task significance. They increase the meaningfulness of the work, and that's the reason you ultimately get motivated, which leads to higher internal motivation, higher performance, higher satisfaction, and then of course you are less likely to leave the job or less likely to be absent on your job. Similarly, autonomy gives you a sense of responsibility for the outcomes, which also ultimately enhances your intrinsic satisfaction, intrinsic motivation, higher performance, and so on and so forth. Feedback also gives you knowledge about how well or poorly you are doing, which also then has the same positive impact. The feedback also provides you avenues for growth. You then know what to work on when things aren't working. So these are the psychological states that these job characteristics provide, which ultimately lead to higher motivation, higher performance, higher satisfaction. So that's the job characteristics model. So the job characteristics model has a lot of implications. Simply speaking, you as managers, you as leaders will have to focus on enhancing these 5 characteristics as much as possible. Again, you may not be able to make a job completely perfect, right? It may not be high on all those 5 dimensions, but as much as possible, you try to design or redesign the job in a way that enhances some or as many of these components. And if you do that, then your employees, your subordinates will find that job much more intrinsically satisfying, and you will have to rely less on giving them extrinsic rewards, incentives to get them motivated. And sometimes, the job itself may not be able to give them that immediate feedback. In that case, you provide the feedback about how well or poorly they are doing, and not in terms of being judgmental about how good or bad they are, but in terms of how well they are progressing in their developmental process. So the feedback also needs to be constructive, right? So that's about some of the broad managerial implications of the job characteristics model. Talking about the flow model, which I just mentioned briefly, the research done by Mihai and Mihai, the jobs may involve some high level of skill or low skill. The jobs may challenge you at a high level or low level. If you have really high skill, but the job task is not challenging, let's say it is at low challenging level, you will be bored. You will not be finding those tasks intrinsically satisfying. Whereas if your job is extremely challenging, the task that you have to do is extremely challenging, high, but your skill level is low, okay, you will be highly stressed doing those jobs. So after some time you may burn out. You will not be able to perform well on those jobs. So the ideal then is to find a proper balance where there is a right match between your skill level and the challenge that the job provides. Then you will be in the flow zone. Then you will find the job deeply satisfying. If, for example, I were to play basketball, okay, I will be very frustrated because my skill level in basketball is really low. And if I'm playing with players who are extremely competent, I will be either too stressed or I will give up. They are too good. I'm not being able to throw a ball straight into the basket. Okay, but it's because of my low skill level in basketball. If one of our university team players in basketball is playing basketball, he or she will not be stressed, right? He or she may actually be in the flow zone because the level of challenge is matching up with the skill level that they have. If we bring in some extremely top level national NBA athlete working at playing basketball with high school students, the person may not even be challenged. And initially the person may play, but then the person may feel bored because his skill level is super high, but the middle school level students playing basketball, they are not challenging him enough. So that's the psychological flow model. Again, gives you insights about how you should be wise with respect to deciding your tasks that you are performing. And it also gives you some insights about why sometimes you persist on certain things, why sometimes you give up. People many a times think that games, the computer games are so addicting because of the way they have been designed. That's true. That is definitely true. But they have been designed to give you that intermittent rewards. But one of the reasons you get so involved while playing computer games is also because your skill level matches with the challenge that the game provides. During the initial stages of a game, your skill level in that game will be lower, okay? But the challenge level is also lower. So you are in flow zone. As you play more, your skill level increases. In the game also the challenge level gradually increases. So you stay in the flow level, and that's how you get so involved playing those computer games. Now, why can't we, or as much as possible, why can't we design jobs in such a way? Why can't we as leaders challenge our followers, our subordinates also in that way as much as possible. Again, it is not completely possible, but if we as leaders figure out the competency level of our followers and give them appropriate level challenges, then they will find those jobs more intrinsically motivating. So these are some of the implications, then practical implications of these different theories. To illustrate the power of intrinsic motivation, let me give the example of Jimmy Wales, or something that he created. I don't know how many of you know of Jimmy Wales. He actually went to the same university where I went to, Indiana University, also for the PhD program, although he went several years before that I went to IU for my PhD. But unlike me, he dropped out of the program. He couldn't complete the PhD. But he then later on became very successful. He initially found a adult entertainment kind of website from which whatever money that he earned, he found something else that became extremely successful. He found Wikipedia. Okay, you all know Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia that we use a lot anytime that we are researching any particular topic. It has its weaknesses, but it is still one of the most visited sites on the internet. How many of you have heard of Microsoft Encarta? Probably not many. Why? Because it doesn't exist anymore. Microsoft, this huge financial behemoth, also started an online encyclopedia on the lines of Encyclopedia Britannica, the physical form of those encyclopedias. And they started it with a very different model. They brought in experts to write articles on different subjects, and then they paid them, and that's how the encyclopedia, the Encarta system worked, similar to the system that Encyclopedia Britannica had, where different experts wrote the articles on the different subjects. But what is the model that Wikipedia followed? They were not hiring experts to write those articles. Anyone could write articles on Wikipedia, anyone who had interest in those topics. And they were not paying them either. Forget paying them, they were not even recognizing the names. So if you wrote an article on Wikipedia, it doesn't have your name in the article of you having written those articles or you having edited those articles. It's all anonymous, right? And yet a model that was not rewarding you either monetarily or in form of recognition ended up being so successful, and a model that relied on rewards in form of giving recognition, credit to those authors, model that also paid them for writing those articles did not succeed. Wikipedia is a great example of things working only based on intrinsic motivation. There is no extrinsic reward that you are getting when you are writing or editing articles for the Wikipedia. Microsoft Encarta, on the other hand, was a model focused on extrinsic motivation, and it didn't work out. So don't underestimate the power of intrinsic motivation. When you are intrinsically motivated, or when people are intrinsically motivated, they will work very hard. They will, even if they are not getting any external rewards, they will work very hard. They will invest a lot of time and energy into those jobs. That's exactly what we find happening in case of Wikipedia. The people who are writing on those different topics are the ones who are passionate about those topics. And because of the passion, they have researched those topics, and they write those articles. They make the necessary edits when somebody else make any corrections. So that's how Wikipedia has been so successful. That's the power of intrinsic motivation. So I'm not arguing that intrinsic motivation is always better than extrinsic motivation, because there is a need for extrinsic motivation. It fulfills some of our needs, right? Through getting those rewards, our needs are getting fulfilled. But intrinsic motivation matters as well, because it makes us stick. It makes us get excited about things. The work itself is getting us excited, not some reward that may come after we finish all the work, not some reward that will come at the end, right? So ideally, we want a lot of intrinsic motivation. And if we can figure out ways to intrinsically motivate ourselves as well as others, then we will be more successful in our approach. So that's what we want to achieve. We try to strike a balance between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So it's not that extrinsic is bad, intrinsic is good, or intrinsic is bad, extrinsic is good. Both play their roles. But as much as possible, we also need to incorporate intrinsic motivation. And unfortunately, many managers only rely on incentives, on extrinsic motivation when they're trying to motivate people. But you, who knows about intrinsic motivations, who knows about how to redesign jobs, how to challenge people to the appropriate level so that they find the jobs motivating, you then, using these methods, can make the jobs deeply intrinsically satisfying as well. So that's what I hope you will be able to accomplish by applying the different theories that I discussed in context of intrinsic motivation.